December 18, 1944. The Hurtgen forest along the German-Belgian border lay shrouded in morning mist, its frozen ground littered with abandoned equipment and the detritus of 3 months of brutal woodland fighting. American observation posts reported unusual silence from German positions across a narrow valley, punctuated only by the distant rumble of artillery fire several kilometers to the south. The soldiers of the 2nd Infantry Division had grown accustomed to this eerie quiet, the kind that preceded either withdrawal or ambush. What none of them knew was that one man was about to transform this frozen stillness into his personal hunting ground, using a technique so audacious that decades later, military tacticians would still debate whether it was brilliant improvisation or calculated madness. Thomas James Ashworth was 22 years old that December morning, a lean man from Massachusetts with a degree in psychology and literature from the University of Massachusetts that seemed entirely irrelevant to his current circumstances. He had joined the army in 1942, motivated less by patriotism than by a desperate need to escape the suffocating expectations of his academic family. His father, Professor Harold Ashworth, taught classical literature at Amherst College and had expected Thomas to pursue graduate work at Yale, following 3 generations of family tradition. Instead, Thomas found himself in the frozen forests of Europe, assigned to the 2nd Battalion as a scout sniper, a role that demanded patience observation and an almost theatrical understanding of human behavior. 3 months before Pearl Harbor, father and son had sat across from each other in their book-lined study in Amherst. Harold had already arranged the graduate placement. The future was decided, or so he believed. "You want to study stories about war, father? I need to understand what war actually is." Professor Ashworth's face had darkened. "Don't be romantic, Thomas. War is mechanical slaughter. There's nothing to understand that hasn't been written in Homer Thucydides' Caesar. Those are their stories, written by survivors for the victors. I want to know what the men who didn't write books experienced, what they actually saw." The argument had escalated. Harold slammed his hand on the desk, his voice rising with each word. "Then study psychology, study trauma testimonies, but for God's sake don't throw away everything we've built." Thomas had enlisted the next day. His father didn't speak to him at the bus station. Now, 2 years later, that academic rebellion had led him to this frozen forest where theory met reality in ways no classroom could prepare him for. During basic training at Fort Benning, while other recruits focused on marksmanship and physical conditioning, Thomas found himself obsessed with different questions. Why did instructors teach soldiers to scan horizontally but rarely look down? Why did human eyes track movement but dismiss stillness? Why did soldiers in foxholes watch the horizon instead of the ground directly in front of them? He filled notebooks with observations that baffled his drill sergeants. One notation would prove prophetic. Human vision is narrative-driven. We see what we expect to see next in the story we're telling ourselves about the environment. Soldiers expect threats from cover, from elevation, from movement. They don't expect threats from the ground they've already categorized as dead space. Captain Robert Hayes, 34 years old and pragmatic to his bones, had noticed something unusual about the young private during sniper training at Fort Bragg. Ashworth's marksmanship scores were excellent, but not exceptional. What caught Hayes's attention was a training evaluation that read, "Private Ashworth demonstrates unusual observational patterns. During field exercises, he focuses on how enemy soldiers distribute attention rather than where they position themselves. Recommends specialized reconnaissance training." Hayes had called him in. "Your shooting is adequate, Private. Your psychological analysis is weird. Explain why you think that matters in combat." Thomas had spent 30 minutes diagramming on a chalkboard how human visual processing worked, how the brain filtered massive sensory input through expectation frameworks, how trained soldiers developed specific threat scanning patterns, how those patterns created exploitable blind spots. Hayes, skeptical but intrigued, had cut to the heart of it. "So you're saying if you understand how Germans think they should watch for threats, you can position yourself where they won't look?" "Not where they won't look, Captain. Where they'll look, but won't see. There's a difference. Vision isn't just about light hitting the retina. It's about the brain deciding what's important." Hayes had assigned him to scout sniper training with a note. "This one thinks like a college professor. Might be useful. Might get himself killed. Worth finding out." By September 1944, the 2nd Infantry Division had deployed to the Hurtgen Forest 50 square miles of dense woodland that would consume 33,000 American casualties over 6 months. The forest had earned its nickname quickly, the Death Factory. The problem wasn't German numerical superiority. American forces often outnumbered the defenders. The problem was invisibility. German positions were masterworks of concealment, integrated into the terrain so completely that American units would walk past bunkers only to be destroyed from behind by machine gun fire they never saw coming. Ashworth's first week in the forest, he observed 5 separate attacks fail with devastating casualties. American soldiers advancing in textbook formations, following doctrine, doing everything right and dying in droves because they couldn't see the enemy until fire erupted from everywhere at once. While other soldiers focused on survival, Ashworth studied patterns. German positions never revealed themselves until Americans were fully committed to an advance. Enemy observers changed positions irregularly, never establishing routines. They positioned themselves where Americans would be looking into glare morning sun or afternoon reflection off snow. Most significantly, they had learned to ignore certain categories of stillness. His notebook entry from October 15th captured the insight that would change everything. Watched German observer through scope for 6 hours today. He scanned our lines constantly, but his eyes passed over 3 separate dead Americans in no man's land without pause. Not because he couldn't see them. I watched him look directly at the bodies, but his brain had categorized them as already processed information. Dead men aren't threats. His training taught him to focus on threats. This is exploitable. The German forces occupying the opposite ridge belonged to well-trained units reinforced with veterans from the Eastern Front. These were not inexperienced conscripts. These men understood winter warfare, understood concealment, and most importantly understood patience. Their positions were commanded by Hauptmann Ernst Keller, a 38-year-old career soldier from Dresden, who had spent 2 years facing Soviet snipers before his transfer west. Unlike the fanatical Nazi officers, Keller was a professional who approached warfare as a craft requiring discipline, intelligence, and patience. His men called him der Lehrer, the teacher, because he approached combat like a chess master, always thinking 3 moves ahead. By late November, American casualties in Ashworth's sector averaged 8 to 12 men per day, not from assaults, but from systematic attrition. Snipers, mortar observers, machine gun teams that appeared fired and vanished before counter-battery fire could respond. What frustrated American intelligence was the discipline. German positions never fired predictably. They never exposed themselves carelessly. Someone was coordinating them with exceptional skill. On November 28th, Ashworth approached Captain Hayes with a thick notebook filled with diagrams and observations. "Captain, I think I understand what we're facing. Their commander, whoever he is, has trained his men to operate like a single organism." He showed Hayes the patterns he had documented. German observers rotated positions every 4 to 6 hours, but never at regular intervals. They used dead ground slight depressions invisible from American lines to move between positions. Most crucially, they had learned not to respond to obvious bait, showing remarkable fire discipline. "This isn't random, sir. Someone's teaching them. Someone smart. Someone patient." Hayes studied the maps, his weathered face thoughtful. "What are you proposing? I need to get close. Close enough to see what they see, watch what they watch. Close enough to understand the system before we try to break it." "How close?" "No man's land close. Among the dead." Hayes stared at him, his expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief. "You want to lie among casualties in the valley and observe from there. Maybe for days. The Germans have trained themselves to ignore the dead captain. That's their blind spot. That's not a blind spot, Private. That's suicide. You'd be exposed to fire from both sides, unable to move in sub-freezing temperatures with no support. With perfect observation of their entire defensive network from a lateral perspective, they're not monitoring. Sir, they watch our ridge. They watch for movement, for muzzle flash, for anything elevated. They don't watch the ground they've already fought over." Hayes wanted to refuse immediately. 3 months of failure had taught him that conventional tactics weren't working, but this proposal seemed insane. "You're talking about extreme cold exposure. 48 hours immobile could kill you." "Could. Or I could identify every German position in the sector and give you a way to break this stalemate." Hayes made a decision that would haunt him for decades. "I'll authorize a trial. 24 hours. You identify positions, signal back, and withdraw. That's it. If this works, we'll discuss extending it. If it doesn't, I'm pulling you out, assuming you survive." The catalyst came on December 17th, when a dawn patrol from Company F engaged a German reconnaissance team in the valley. The brief firefight left 5 bodies sprawled across 150 meters of frozen ground, 2 American, 3 German, all motionless in death's final positions. Throughout that day, Ashworth watched through his scope as German observers scanned the valley repeatedly. Their eyes passed over the fallen men without pause, dismissing them as irrelevant to current tactical concerns. Not one soldier showed interest. The dead had become invisible not because they couldn't be seen, but because trained minds had categorized them as processed information, requiring no further attention. That evening, Ashworth told Hayes he was ready. December 17th, 2200 hours. Ashworth sat in a makeshift observation post preparing equipment with ritualistic precision. Hayes watched, still not entirely convinced this would work. The loadout was carefully considered. M1903 Springfield, rifle bolt action for reliability in extreme cold. 30 rounds of 30-aught, 6 ammunition, minimal load to reduce weight that would affect natural positioning. Winter camouflage treated with snow mud and pine sap to eliminate any artificial whiteness. Over this, the outer garment from a deceased German soldier, creating an ambiguous silhouette if observed at close range. Torn fabric wrapped around the rifle to break up its outline. No food, as scent would alert patrols. A single canteen of water that would freeze solid, but was necessary. A red-filtered flashlight for potential night signaling. Hayes broke the silence. You understand, if your position is compromised, we can't extract you. Artillery could fall on that valley from either side. I understand. And you can't move. If Germans see movement among those bodies, they won't see movement. Hayes used his first name, which he rarely did. Thomas. This isn't a training exercise. This is war. Ashworth looked up from his preparations. This is war, Captain. And warfare isn't just violence. It's psychology. It's understanding what the enemy expects and operating outside those expectations. My father never understood about Homer. The Trojan horse wasn't clever carpentry. It was psychological warfare. The Trojans expected threats that looked like threats, so Odysseus gave them something that looked like a gift. Hayes noticed the German tunic Ashworth planned to wear. That's from the casualties yesterday. Yes, sir. If German patrols come close, the silhouette needs to read ambiguously. An American uniform among German casualties would register as unusual. Mixed uniforms in a firefight site register as expected. Jesus, Thomas, you've thought of everything. Not everything. I'm about to discover what I missed. Hayes laid out the final conditions. You signal every 12 hours. If you miss 2 signals, I'm sending a patrol to pull you out, which will probably get them killed and definitely blow your position. Can you commit to that? I can. Both men knew that once Ashworth entered that valley, he would be entirely on his own. No doctrine, no support, no backup plan. Just a 22-year-old with a rifle and a theory about human perception. At 0400 hours, December 18th, with the temperature at -8 degrees Celsius, Thomas Ashworth crawled into darkness. The movement took 45 minutes to cover ground. He could have walked across in 5. He crawled with agonizing slowness, testing each hand placement, each knee position, ensuring nothing created visual contrast against snow. He positioned himself in a slight depression near 4 bodies, 2 American and 2 German, intermixed in positions suggesting close-quarters combat. The sight made narrative sense. A meeting engagement, both sides surprised firefight at close-range mutual casualties. Dawn broke at 0712. As light spread across the valley, Ashworth settled into absolute stillness. Not the stillness of hiding, but the stillness of death. His breathing became shallow and irregular, mimicking fabric settling in wind. His hands remained motionless. Most critically, his eyes stayed mostly closed, moving in slow, tracking patterns that never locked onto single points, avoiding the focused gaze that experienced soldiers could sometimes sense. This wasn't simply patience. This was transformation. Ashworth needed to become functionally invisible, not by hiding, but by embodying exactly what German observers expected to see. Another casualty in a valley full of casualties. At 0743, a German observation post on the ridge swept binoculars across the valley. The observer's gaze passed directly over Ashworth's position without pause. It was working. Through barely open eyes, Ashworth began cataloguing the German defensive network. A forward observer, 240 meters northwest, identifiable by the radio antenna, barely visible, and the periodic raising of field glasses. A machine gun position, 230 meters northwest, concealed in a fallen tree with exceptional camouflage. A mortar observer 260 meters northeast occupying a rocky outcrop. A communication trench nearly invisible from American lines but clearly visible from his lateral perspective. Most significantly, a command post in a reinforced bunker 300 meters distant, recognizable by the frequency of messenger traffic. What American intelligence had estimated as 8 to 10 German positions was actually 17 integrated strong points, each supporting the others in a sophisticated network. By noon, Ashworth had been motionless in sub-freezing temperatures for 8 hours. His extremities had passed through cold into numbness. But his mind remained crystalline focused, recording every detail of the enemy system. At 1300 hours, he made his decision to fire. The target was a German sergeant who emerged from the command bunker field glasses raised toward the American lines. Range 280 meters with a slight crosswind from the northeast. Ashworth had been motionless for 9 hours. His body screamed for movement, for warmth, for relief. He ignored it all. His mind remained sharp, calculating wind distance, the slight elevation difference. He adjusted his aim, released half a breath, and squeezed the trigger with the same deliberate pressure he had been taught during training. The sergeant collapsed instantly. The reaction from German positions was exactly what Ashworth had calculated. Soldiers ducked into cover, scanning for muzzle flash or movement along the American ridgeline. Several began returning fire toward the American positions, clearly believing the shot had originated from there. Not one German observer looked toward the valley floor where Ashworth lay motionless among the dead. Their training and experience told them to focus on elevated positions on likely locations for sniper hides. The concept that a sniper might be operating from the valley floor exposed and surrounded by casualties was so counterintuitive that it did not register as possibility. Ashworth waited 47 minutes before his next shot. During this time, German soldiers gradually returned to their routines, convinced they had identified and suppressed the American sniper position. When a forward observer raised his head to scan the American lines, Ashworth fired again. The range was more difficult, 310 meters, with the target partially obscured by brush. The round struck the observer in the upper torso. He fell back into his position. Now confusion spread through the German lines. The angle of the second shot was inconsistent with the first. German soldiers began firing at multiple points along the American ridge, trying to identify where the shots were originating. Through his scope, Ashworth saw a German officer gesturing frantically, pointing in different directions. The defensive network was beginning to fracture under pressure from an enemy they couldn't locate, couldn't suppress, couldn't understand. Fear of the invisible, Ashworth knew, was more corrosive than fear of the visible. An enemy you can see, you can fight. An enemy you can't locate, lives in your mind, grows larger with each passing hour, undermines confidence and discipline. By 1800 hours, Ashworth had fired 11 rounds, 9 confirmed casualties, 2 forced position abandonments. As darkness fell across the frozen valley, he faced the decision that would define everything that followed. Withdraw as planned or remain through the night to continue operations. The original mission parameters called for withdrawal after 24 hours. But Ashworth recognized that returning to this position would be nearly impossible. The Germans would eventually analyze shooting angles, realize their vulnerability. If he withdrew now, he would lose this unique tactical advantage. The temperature was dropping toward -12 degrees Celsius. He had been motionless for 14 hours. His water had frozen solid. His extremities had lost feeling. Every survival instinct screamed at him to withdraw while he still could. But the intelligence he was gathering, the disruption he was causing, was more valuable than anticipated. The German defensive network was cracking. Another day might break it entirely. Thomas Ashworth decided to remain in position through the night, pushing himself into a realm of physical endurance that few soldiers ever experienced or survived. This decision would change the course of the battle, revolutionize infantry tactics, and haunt him for the rest of his life. In the gathering darkness surrounded by the dead, a young scholar from Massachusetts transformed himself into something the German army had never encountered before. Not a soldier, not a sniper, something else entirely. A ghost among the fallen. The night descended like a physical weight. Temperature plummeted to -12 degrees Celsius. Thomas Ashworth lay absolutely motionless as frost began forming on his outer garments, on the fabric wrapped around his rifle, on the exposed skin of his face. Each breath crystallized in the air, and he had to control even this tiny cloud of vapor that might give him away. He could not move to generate warmth, could not eat as movement and scent would alert patrols, could only endure maintaining the absolute stillness that kept him invisible. His body temperature began dropping in stages. First, his extremities went numb, fingers and toes losing sensation as blood flow concentrated on core organs. Then came the shivering, violent and uncontrollable. He had to suppress it through pure mental discipline, forcing his muscles to remain still, even as they screamed for the heat-generating motion of tremors. This pushed him into physical extremes that military doctrine said were unsurvivable. His body was shutting down non-essential systems, conserving energy, prioritizing core temperature over extremities. But his mind, trained by years of academic discipline to maintain focus through discomfort, remained operational. He thought of his father's study, those endless afternoons, sitting motionless while memorizing Greek declensions, Latin conjugations. The old man had been preparing him for this without knowing it. At 21:47 hours, voices cut through the darkness. Ashworth's eyes closed immediately. He controlled his breathing to the point where chest movements became imperceptible beneath his outer garments, reducing his respiration to shallow, irregular patterns that mimicked the settling of fabric in the wind. The German patrol moved through the valley, 6 men with flashlights sweeping across the frozen ground. They were searching more carefully than any previous patrol. Someone had given them orders to look for something unusual to question what they saw, to verify that the dead were truly dead. Boots crunched through snow, moving closer. 25 meters. 20 meters. 15. The patrol stopped near the cluster of bodies where Ashworth lay concealed. One soldier approached, flashlight raised. Ashworth could hear breathing, could sense the beam of light playing across the casualties around him. He could smell cigarette smoke, hear the creak of leather equipment, the metallic click of a rifle safety being checked. This was the crisis point. If the soldier examined bodies closely, touched them to check for warmth or stiffness, Ashworth's concealment would fail catastrophically. He would have perhaps 2 seconds to decide whether to remain still and hope or to fight his way out against 6 armed men. The German bent down. Through closed eyelids, Ashworth sensed the flashlight beam move across his position. Pause. Linger. His heart rate, which he had trained himself to control, remained steady at 48 beats per minute. Every muscle in his body screamed for movement, for reaction, for escape. He gave them nothing. He was a corpse. Corpses don't respond to examination. Corpses don't flinch when light hits their faces. The soldier straightened. "Nichts here. Just corpses." A voice from farther away, impatient and cold. "Schmidt, beeil dich. We have more ground to cover." The patrol moved on, voices fading into darkness. Ashworth opened his eyes to slits. His heart rate gradually returned to normal resting level. He had passed the first test of the night, but there would be more. The Germans were actively searching now. Someone suspected something. He wouldn't learn until 40 years later that the soldier called Schmidt had seen him, had noticed the slight movement of eyes, and had chosen mercy over duty. 300 meters away in the German command bunker on Ridge 493, Hauptmann Ernst Keller studied reports with growing concern. The former schoolteacher turned professional soldier had spent 15 years learning to read the patterns of combat, and something about today's casualties felt wrong. The angles were impossible. The timing was too precise. The psychological impact too calculated. 9 men today. 9 excellent soldiers lost to a sniper we cannot locate. Not random harassment. This is systematic dismantling of our defensive structure. His adjutant, Lieutenant Franz Weber, spread maps across the table, tracing vectors with a pencil. "The shooting angles are inconsistent, Herr Hauptmann. First shot came from approximately 270 degrees. Second shot from 245 degrees. Third from 290 degrees. Either we're facing multiple snipers with extraordinary coordination, or one sniper who's somehow moving between positions without being observed." Keller lit a cigarette, his mind working through the tactical puzzle. "What's the common factor? If you draw lines from each casualty position, where do they intersect?" Weber traced sight lines from each casualty position back toward potential firing points. His finger stopped in the valley between ridge lines, and he looked up at Keller with disbelief. "If I trace these back to the only point that could have visual contact with all targets, the intersection is here, the valley floor. But no one could operate from there. It would be suicide. Exposure to fire from both sides, sub-freezing temperatures, no cover for extended periods." Keller stared at the map, and something clicked in his mind. He thought of his years teaching mathematics, teaching students to question assumptions, to look for solutions in unexpected places. 15 years of military experience told him it was impossible. But 38 years of life had taught him that impossible things happened when someone thought differently than everyone else. "The Americans have a sniper in the valley. Among the bodies." Weber looked skeptical. "Herr Hauptmann, respectfully, that would require remaining motionless for hours in these temperatures. The human body cannot maintain that level of stillness without freezing to death, which is exactly why we're not looking there, why I didn't consider it until now. Franz, think about teaching. What's the most effective way to hide something? You don't make it invisible. You make it something the observer has learned to ignore." "What have we learned to ignore?" the dead Weber said slowly, understanding dawning. "Post orders. All observation posts will include valley floor in their scanning patterns. If anything moves down there, anything at all, report immediately, but no more patrols tonight. If someone is there with that level of discipline, a patrol will only confirm his position without catching him. Better to watch, wait, and identify him when he must eventually move. Because he will have to move. No human can maintain that position indefinitely in these temperatures." But Keller had underestimated one critical factor. Ashworth wasn't trying to maintain the position indefinitely. He only needed to maintain it longer than German patience lasted. The second patrol came at 0340 December 19th. Ashworth had been motionless in sub-freezing temperatures for 23 hours. His water canteen had frozen solid hours earlier, the ice expanding until the metal container bulged. His fingers, when he cautiously tested them inside his gloves, moved with painful slowness. Early-stage frostbite was setting in tissue damage at the cellular level that would leave permanent scars. But his position remained secure because his mind refused to acknowledge the body's limitations. He was no longer Thomas Ashworth, graduate of the University of Massachusetts. He was a piece of the landscape, as inanimate as the rocks and frozen earth around him. This patrol was larger, 8 men moving with deliberate care. They examined the terrain more thoroughly, stopping frequently to scan with flashlights and field glasses. They were looking for him specifically now, though they didn't know exactly what they were looking for. One man carried a long pole, and Ashworth realized with cold dread what it was for. They were going to probe the bodies, checking for warmth for response. The patrol approached to within 15 meters. A soldier raised his flashlight, sweeping the beam slowly across the cluster of bodies. Ashworth kept his eyes closed, his breathing imperceptible, his entire being focused on absolute stillness. This was the moment. They would probe the bodies. They would discover him. After 23 hours of perfect concealment, it would end here. The soldier moved closer. 10 meters, 8 meters, 5 meters. Through the darkness came a voice, sharp and commanding. Schmidt was find us due. The soldier with the flashlight paused. His beam played across Ashworth's position for what felt like an eternity. Ashworth could hear his breathing, could sense hesitation. The probe was raised. This was the end. Then inexplicably the soldier lowered the probe. Nur Leichen. Nichts Besonderes. Nothing special here. Another voice irritated. Then stop wasting time. We have 50 more meters to check before dawn. The patrol withdrew. Ashworth remained motionless for another 20 minutes before allowing himself to process what had happened. The soldier called Schmidt had been close enough to see details, close enough to notice anything unusual. Yet he had reported nothing hadn't used. The probe had actively dismissed the position as unworthy of further investigation. Had Ashworth's concealment been perfect? Or had something else occurred in that moment of examination? Something he couldn't understand from his position among the dead. He would not learn the answer for 40 years. Dawn arrived on December 19th, with weak sunlight that provided minimal warmth but transformed visibility across the valley. Ashworth had survived the night, but barely. His core body temperature had dropped into the hypothermia range, somewhere around 34 degrees Celsius. Medical doctrine said he should be incapacitated or dead unconscious from the cold, his brain functions slowing toward shutdown. He remained functional through sheer force of will, the same mental discipline his father had demanded during endless hours of academic study. Sit still. Focus. Ignore discomfort. Maintain concentration regardless of circumstances. He recited Greek poetry in his mind, conjugated Latin verbs, anything to keep his consciousness sharp and focused. He had been training for this his entire life without knowing it. The German defenders were now expecting sniper fire, which made them more cautious but also more predictable. Soldiers who were afraid made different mistakes than confident soldiers. They rushed movements between positions. They bunched together for mutual security. They exposed themselves in patterns driven by fear rather than tactical necessity. Terror created its own rhythm, and Ashworth could read that rhythm like music. Ashworth adjusted his targeting priorities accordingly. Instead of taking every available shot, he fired only when he could achieve maximum psychological impact, when the death of one man would create cascading effects through the entire German defensive structure. At 0847, a German soldier carrying ammunition to a machine gun position moved across open ground. The man was young, maybe 19, and he moved with the jerky haste of someone who knew he was exposed. Range 265 meters. Ashworth fired. Clean hit. The soldier felled the ammunition boxes, scattering across the snow rounds, glinting in weak sunlight. The Germans now faced a choice: abandon that machine gun position for lack of ammunition, or send another runner across the same exposed ground. Ashworth watched through his scope as officers gestured, argued, pointed. They chose to send another runner, a decision driven by tactical necessity and organizational momentum. Ashworth waited until the second soldier was most exposed, committed to the crossing with no chance to retreat. At 0903, he fired again. Another hit. The soldier collapsed. The ammunition remained scattered in the snow, unreachable. The machine gun position was now untenable, abandoned not through direct assault, but through systematic denial of resources. At 11:34, a radio operator moved between the command post and a forward observation position. Ashworth had observed this operator make the same movement 3 times that morning, each time growing more careless in his haste to restore broken communication links. The man probably thought familiarity brought safety, that surviving the route twice meant he understood its dangers. Range 295 meters, moving target. Ashworth led the target, slightly accounting for movement and wind. He fired. The operator fell mid-stride, his radio equipment scattering across the snow. By mid-afternoon of the second day, the German defensive position was disintegrating psychologically. Ashworth watched through his scope as soldiers refused to expose themselves even when tactical necessity demanded it. Officers tried to restore order by moving between positions, making themselves targets in an attempt to shame their men back into discipline. Unit cohesion was fracturing under pressure from an invisible, incomprehensible threat. The machine that Keller had built with such care was breaking down not from physical destruction, but from accumulated psychological strain. At 15:47 hours, Ashworth observed something significant. A German officer emerged from the command bunker and stood in partial cover, deliberately exposing himself while scanning the valley with field glasses. Older than the other soldiers, more composed, moving with the confidence of someone who had survived years of combat on multiple fronts. This was Keller. It had to be Keller. And he was bait, trying to force the sniper to reveal his position by offering a target too valuable to resist. Range 320 meters. A difficult shot. The target was partially concealed behind a broken wall, ready to drop into cover instantly. If Ashworth missed or merely wounded him, Keller would pinpoint his exact location by the angle of the shot. Every German weapon in the sector would concentrate fire on that spot. Mortars would rain down. Artillery would follow. The valley would become an inferno. Ashworth waited. Patience was his greatest advantage. He watched Keller stand exposed for 43 seconds, an impressive display of personal courage and tactical discipline. The German officer was gambling his life on being able to identify the sniper's position before the shot killed him. It was a calculated risk by a man who understood warfare as chess. Then the German officer withdrew into the bunker without Ashworth having fired. A test. Keller was testing him, seeing if he could resist obvious targets, measuring his discipline. Inside that bunker, Keller spoke quietly to Weber. "Did you see anything?" "Nothing, Herr Hauptmann. No muzzle flash, no movement, no indication of where he is." Keller lit another cigarette, his mind analyzing the situation. "Whoever he is, he has extraordinary fire discipline. He's not taking obvious shots. He's not motivated by kill counts or target opportunities. He's targeting based on psychological effect on degrading our organizational structure." Franz. This isn't a typical sniper hunting for medals or revenge. This is someone who understands how fear works, how organizations break under pressure, how to destroy an army without destroying most of its soldiers. What do we do? "Herr Hauptmann, we withdraw. Tonight. This position is untenable, not because we can't hold it physically, but because my men are breaking mentally. One sniper we can't locate is destroying unit cohesion more effectively than an artillery barrage. If we stay, we'll lose more men and eventually collapse anyway. Better to withdraw with discipline than wait for catastrophe. At least we can preserve the unit for the next defensive line." At 1800 hours, German forces began preparing withdrawal to secondary positions 1 kilometer east. Under normal circumstances, a tactical withdrawal could be executed with minimal casualties if properly coordinated. Soldiers would move in carefully timed groups covered by overwatch positions, following rehearsed routes through protected terrain. But these soldiers were no longer operating normally. They had been psychologically compromised by 2 days of systematic pressure from an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't locate, couldn't fight. They bunched together for mutual security, violating basic tactical spacing. They moved too quickly, exposing themselves in their haste to leave the killing ground. They failed to maintain proper intervals between groups. When the withdrawal began at 18:20 hours, it wasn't the orderly tactical movement of a well-trained unit. It was something closer to a rout discipline eroding under accumulated psychological strain. Soldiers who had held positions with courage for months now fled with barely controlled panic. Captain Hayes, observing from American lines through binoculars, immediately recognized the opportunity. "Company F, prepare to advance. The Germans are pulling back. We're taking those positions before their artillery can contest the movement. Move fast, move smart, and watch for booby traps." The American advance encountered minimal resistance. Demoralized German soldiers withdrew rapidly, abandoning positions they had held for months. American forces occupied the ridge in 3 hours ground they had been unable to take in 3 weeks of conventional fighting. They found extensive fortifications, prepared fighting positions, stockpiled ammunition, all abandoned intact because the defenders' will had broken. The cost was 4 Americans wounded, none seriously. German casualties over 2 days totaled 37 personnel, most of them leaders and specialists whose loss was strategically devastating to unit effectiveness. But the numbers didn't capture the full impact.
An entire defensive network had collapsed not from overwhelming force, but from the psychological pressure applied by a single man with a rifle and an understanding of how the human mind processes threat. When American soldiers swept through the valley at 2100 hours, they found Thomas Ashworth still in position, physically unable to move.
His legs would not support his weight muscles, having cannibalized themselves for energy during the long hours of immobility. Soldiers from Company F had to carry him back to American lines like a corpse, his body stiff with cold and exhaustion. The medic's assessment was grim. Core body temperature 34.2 degrees Celsius, dangerously hypothermic and still dropping. Severe dehydration. His blood thickened to the point where his heart struggled to pump it. Early stage frostbite on fingers and toes, tissue damage that would leave permanent scarring and reduced sensation. He had lost 7 pounds in 48 hours, his body consuming muscle mass to maintain core temperature. His hands were so numb that he couldn't release his grip on his rifle. Medics had to carefully pry his fingers open one at a time, the frozen joints cracking as they moved. He had been motionless in sub-freezing temperatures for 48 hours. By every conventional medical understanding, he should have been dead or permanently incapacitated, brain damage from prolonged hypothermia, making higher cognitive function impossible. But when Captain Hayes visited him in the medical tent 2 hours later, wrapped in blankets with heating bottles pressed against his core, Ashworth's first words were clear and focused. "Did we take the ridge?" Hayes nodded, his expression a mixture of admiration and concern. "We took it. 4 wounded, none serious. The Germans lost 37 men, including most of their leadership. They abandoned positions they'd held for 3 months. Thomas, what you did out there changed everything. Divisional command is already asking questions about how we broke through so easily." Ashworth smiled weakly, his lips cracked and bleeding from exposure. "Human psychology is predictable, Captain. Even German psychology. Train someone to ignore the dead and they become blind to threats hiding among corpses. It's elegant in its simplicity." Hayes pulled up a chair, his face growing serious. "You need to know something. Divisional Command has received your intelligence reports. The German withdrawal created a gap in their defensive line about 2 kilometers to the north. They want to exploit it before German reserves can fill the breach and restore the front." Ashworth closed his eyes, already knowing what came next. "The adjacent sector has the same problems we faced here. Expertly concealed positions, mutual support, sophisticated defensive network probably designed by the same commander. Intelligence estimates 6 German positions. Based on your observations and knowing how these people think, I'd guess the actual number is closer to 20. Thomas, I know what I'm asking. You nearly died out there. But if we attack without proper intelligence, we'll lose dozens of men walking into kill zones we can't see." The medical tent was silent except for the hiss of the kerosene heater and the distant sound of artillery fire. Ashworth lay still, feeling warmth slowly returning to his body, feeling the painful pins and needles sensation as blood flow resumed to his extremities. He thought about the men who would die if the attack went forward without intelligence. He thought about his father saying war was barbarism. He thought about the choice between personal suffering and collective survival. Finally, Ashworth opened his eyes. 4 hours of sleep, hot meal, then I'll do it again. Hayes exhaled slowly, not sure whether to feel relieved or guilty. "You don't have to do this, Thomas. No one would blame you for refusing. You've already done more than anyone could ask." "Yes, I do. Because if I don't, soldiers die. Good men with families, with futures, with lives they want to live. My discomfort versus their lives. The mathematics aren't complicated, Captain. The calculus is simple, even if the execution is hard." But there was something else in Ashworth's eyes that Hayes couldn't quite read. A darkness that went beyond simple courage or sense of duty. Later, Hayes would realize what he had seen in that moment. Ashworth wasn't just willing to endure hardship for tactical advantage. He was drawn to it, testing his limits, pushing himself beyond what should be survivable. Perhaps trying to prove something to himself about the superiority of mind over body. Perhaps trying to prove something to a father who had called warfare barbarism and intellectual surrender. At 0300 hours on December 21st, after 4 hours of fitful sleep, interrupted by violent shivering fits after forcing down a meal his stomach wanted to reject, Private First Class Thomas Ashworth crawled back into no man's land for the 3rd time. The ghost was returning to his hunting ground. The 3rd mission was simultaneously easier and more dangerous than the first 2. Easier because Ashworth now had experience with the physical and psychological demands, knew how his body would respond to extreme cold, understood the rhythm of German patrols and observation patterns. He knew the stages of hypothermia intimately, now knew how to manage each phase, knew what his mind would do as his body temperature dropped. More dangerous because word had spread through German units about unusual American sniper tactics, and soldiers were now specifically briefed to watch for anything out of the ordinary. The technique that had worked through novelty was now anticipated. Keller had probably briefed adjacent sectors about the possibility of snipers concealed among casualties. Ashworth selected a new position on a steep slope where erosion had created a small, natural hollow, a slight depression that would be invisible from the German ridge but would give him a raised perspective on their positions. He covered himself not just with winter camouflage, but with actual snow, using a small collapsible shovel to build up a thin layer that disguised his human outline while still allowing him to observe and fire through a carefully constructed gap no larger than a fist. The technique was more concealing but also more confining. Once he settled into position, he had virtually no mobility. If his location was discovered, he would be unable to evade or defend himself effectively. He would simply die there, buried in snow, another casualty in a forest that had already consumed thousands. The German positions in this sector were held by elements of the 89th Infantry Division, a unit with better training and equipment than the forces Ashworth had faced previously. These soldiers moved with greater caution, exposed themselves less frequently, maintained superior camouflage discipline. They were professionals who understood their craft, veterans who had survived multiple campaigns and learned from each one. Ashworth spent the entire morning observing before considering his first shot, gradually building a mental map of the defensive network, noting not just positions but patterns of behavior, communication links, supply routes, command relationships. What he discovered was tactically significant and deeply troubling. The German positions were not simply a linear defensive line, but a sophisticated network of mutually supporting strongpoints. Any American assault would advance into carefully prepared kill zones where multiple machine gun positions could deliver intersecting fields of fire. The defensive plan relied on concealment and coordination. Attackers would be destroyed not by overwhelming force, but by superior positioning and timing, by interlocking fires that left no safe ground, no covered approaches. If American forces attacked without identifying these positions, casualties would be catastrophic. This would be worse than the first sector, more lethal, more carefully designed. By noon, Ashworth had identified 14 German positions. But something felt wrong. Years of studying human behavior and psychological patterns had given him an instinct for deception, and that instinct was screaming at him now. The patterns were too obvious in some places, too invisible in others. 3 of the positions were 2 exposed soldiers moving with exaggerated visibility, almost as if they wanted to be seen. Meanwhile, soldiers in less obvious positions barely moved at all, maintaining discipline that seemed excessive even for well-trained troops. The contrast was too stark, too deliberate. Ashworth realized what he was seeing. Decoys. Keller had anticipated his return and was feeding him false intelligence, trying to use his own technique against him. The recognition elevated the tactical situation to something more complex than simple sniping. This was an intellectual duel between 2 minds that understood warfare as psychology rather than just violence. Keller was trying to deceive American intelligence by showing them what they expected to see, positions that matched their assumptions about German defensive doctrine. The real positions were harder to spot, required more patience to identify. Ashworth had 2 choices: report the false positions to Hayes and allow the American attack to fail spectacularly, walking into kill zones while avoiding decoys, or remain in position even longer, observing with greater patience to distinguish between decoys and actual threats based on subtle behavioral cues that most observers would never notice. He chose the harder path, the one that required more time in the cold, more risk of exposure, more testing of limits already pushed beyond reasonable bounds. For the next 4 hours, Ashworth watched. Not just positions, but patterns of behavior. How soldiers moved when they thought no one was watching versus how they moved when performing for potential observers. How often they exposed themselves. The rhythm of their routines. The subtle differences between men who were genuinely defending a position they believed was critical and men who were playing a role manning a position they knew was expendable. Soldiers in the false positions moved with mechanical regularity, like actors following a script. Every movement was slightly too precise, too predictable. Soldiers in the real strong points moved with organic irregularity, the natural variation of humans performing familiar tasks under stress. They scratched, shifted weight, made small adjustments that had no tactical purpose but satisfied human needs for comfort and movement. By 1600 hours, through patient observation and psychological analysis, Ashworth had identified the complete picture. 3 false positions minimally staffed for show, manned by soldiers who probably knew they were bait. 11 actual strongpoints, heavily staffed and expertly concealed the real teeth of the defensive network. A command post identifiable by subtle messenger traffic patterns, by the slight deference soldiers showed when moving past certain positions. an artillery observer position marked by an unusual radio antenna configuration, barely visible through camouflage by the presence of maps and range cards. More valuable than the positions themselves was what they revealed about Keller's tactical thinking. The German commander was intelligent, patient, willing to use elaborate deception that required sophisticated briefing and coordination. He thought several moves ahead, anticipated enemy responses, operated on a level that transcended simple reactive defense. This was warfare as chess, as theater, as psychology. Ashworth felt something unexpected. Respect. Professional admiration for an adversary worthy of his full attention and best effort. At 13:30 hours, Ashworth took his first shot of the day. The target was a German lieutenant who had exposed himself while moving between positions to coordinate defensive preparations, probably making last-minute adjustments to the deception plan. Range 290 meters. Ashworth fired. The lieutenant fell, his body rolling slightly down the slope before coming to rest against a tree. The reaction from German positions was immediate and violent. Machine guns opened fire across the entire sector, tearing through brush and trees where they suspected the sniper might be concealed. Artillery began falling on likely sniper positions along the American ridgeline, heavier and more accurate than before. The volume of fire was impressive, well coordinated, and utterly misdirected. None of it came near Ashworth's actual position. Throughout the afternoon, Ashworth continued his systematic degradation of the German defensive network, firing when he could achieve maximum effect with minimum exposure. He shot a machine gun team leader who exposed himself while directing fire-eliminating leadership rather than random soldiers. He eliminated a mortar observer whose position had been nearly impossible to detect from American lines, but was clearly visible from his lateral perspective, removing a key link in the indirect fire support network. He wounded a German sergeant who was attempting to restore order among soldiers, increasingly reluctant to expose themselves further, degrading unit cohesion and command authority. By evening, Ashworth had fired 28 rounds, his most active day of shooting. The German defenders were demoralized and disorganized. More significantly, Ashworth had identified every key position in the defensive network, distinguishing between Keller's clever decoys and the real threats that would destroy an American assault. As darkness fell on December 21st, he faced another decision point. His body was deteriorating rapidly. He had lost an additional 4 pounds since the previous mission, his face gaunt, his muscles wasted. His extremities showed advanced signs of frostbite, fingers and toes darkening in a way that suggested permanent damage. His core temperature was dangerously low. Medical officers would later say that he was operating in a state that should have resulted in cognitive impairment or unconsciousness, that his brain should have been shutting down. But his mind remained sharp, focused on the mission with absolute clarity, born from having done this before, from knowing he could survive what should kill him. He used a flashlight with a red filter to signal American lines in Morse code, transmitting detailed intelligence over 45 minutes. But instead of simple position coordinates, he transmitted something more complex. 17 positions identified, 3 decoys marked with D designation, actual strong points at the following coordinates. German commander attempting tactical deception. Recommend assault plan bypass false positions entirely and concentrate force against junction points in actual defensive network. Commander is intelligent and anticipates conventional responses. Captain Hayes received the transmission with a mixture of admiration and dread. The intelligence officer standing beside him was skeptical. How can he possibly distinguish between decoys and real positions after one day of observation in those conditions? His judgment must be impaired by hypothermia. Hayes studied the map where Ashworth's coordinates had been plotted. Because he's Thomas Ashworth, he sees what others don't. He understands people, not just positions, and his track record speaks for itself. The last time we doubted him, we won a battle we should have lost. At 2300 hours, Ashworth began his crawl back to American lines. The movement took 3 hours, twice as long as it should have. He had lost so much muscle mass and body temperature that his coordination was severely compromised. Several times he had to stop, unsure if he could continue his body, simply refusing to obey commands from his deteriorating nervous system. He vomited once from exhaustion, the sound terrifyingly loud in the frozen night. When he finally reached friendly positions, his condition was worse than after either previous mission. He had lost 11 pounds total over 5 days, his body consuming itself to survive. Advanced frostbite affected 3 fingers on his left hand, the tissue damage severe enough that amputation was being discussed. His core temperature was 33.8 degrees Celsius, severe hypothermia that should have been fatal. He showed early signs of kidney dysfunction from extreme dehydration, his organs beginning to fail from the accumulated stress. Partial snowblindness from prolonged observation through minimal eye openings left him seeing the world through a fog. Medical officers recommended immediate evacuation to rear area hospitals, arguing that another day in the field could kill him or leave him permanently disabled. Ashworth refused with the same quiet determination he had shown before every mission. There was work to complete, intelligence to document, a battle to win. Instead, he spent the night creating a detailed map of German positions, annotating it with notes about fields of fire, dead space, optimal approach routes, and clearly marking which positions were decoys designed to mislead American intelligence. His hands shook so badly that the notations were barely legible, but the information was complete and accurate. He worked through the night, refusing sleep, knowing that men would die if this intelligence wasn't perfect. December 22nd arrived with cold clarity. At 0500 hours, American forces advanced using routes Ashworth had identified. The assault plan was unconventional, designed around psychological insight rather than conventional doctrine. Avoid the false positions entirely, denying Germans the expected target. Bypass the strongest strongpoints where they expected the main effort. Concentrate force against junction points where the defensive network was most vulnerable, the places where loss of a single position would collapse mutual support arrangements. The attack achieved complete surprise. German soldiers manning the decoy positions watched in confusion as American forces ignored them entirely, advancing through gaps in the defensive network that shouldn't have been visible to enemy intelligence. By the time Keller realized that his elaborate deception had been penetrated, understood that the Americans somehow knew exactly which positions were real and which were theater. American forces were already among his real positions, exploiting the very gaps he had thought concealed. The fighting was brief but intense. German defenders, already demoralized by 3 days of systematic psychological pressure, offered only sporadic resistance. Many surrendered quickly, recognizing that their defensive network had been compromised so thoroughly that resistance was futile. American forces overran positions with minimal casualties, capturing 17 prisoners and securing the objective by 0800 hours. The most significant moment came at 0634, when American soldiers reached what Ashworth had identified as the German command post. Inside the reinforced bunker, they found Hauptmann Ernst Keller, Lieutenant Franz Weber, and 3 radio operators preparing to coordinate a withdrawal that would now never happen. Keller's first words to the American lieutenant who took him prisoner were unexpected. "Your sniper, the one who identified our positions and saw through our deception. I want to meet him. I need to understand how he did it." December 23rd, prisoner processing area. Against regulations, but with Hayes's quiet approval and recognition that this conversation might yield valuable intelligence, Thomas Ashworth met with Ernst Keller. The 2 men sat across a field table in a medical tent, steam rising from cups of weak coffee. Ashworth was still receiving intravenous fluids, his frostbitten fingers wrapped in bandages. Keller wore a prisoner's uniform, but was treated with the respect befitting his rank and professional competence. Keller spoke first in excellent English, his voice carrying the cultured accent of an educated man. 3 days. 48 hours motionless in freezing temperatures for your first mission, then you did it again. Twice more. Most soldiers would consider 1 day impossible. You did it 3 times and survived. How Ashworth's voice was quiet, weakened by physical exhaustion, but still clear. "You made it necessary, Captain. Your defensive network was the finest I've encountered. The deception with false positions was brilliant, sophisticated, exactly what I would have done in your position. It almost worked. Thank you, though, apparently not brilliant enough. May I ask how you identified the decoys? I was quite proud of that plan. We spent a week preparing it, briefing the men, coordinating the deception. Behavioral patterns. Your soldiers in false positions moved too regularly, too visibly. They were performing rather than defending. Real soldiers in genuine defensive positions minimize exposure, instinctively move with organic irregularity. The difference was subtle but observable if you watched long enough and understood what you were seeing, if you looked for patterns in human behavior rather than just tactical positioning. How long did you watch before you were certain? 14 hours before I could distinguish pattern from noise with confidence, before I was willing to bet American lives on my assessment." Keller shook his head slowly, something like awe in his expression. 14 hours motionless in sub-freezing temperatures, distinguishing between genuine and false positions based on behavioral minutiae most trained observers would never notice. You're either insane or the most gifted tactical analyst I've encountered in 15 years of warfare. Possibly both, Ashworth acknowledged with a slight smile. "Captain, may I ask you something? Before the war, you were a schoolteacher in Dresden. Correct mathematics and literature." Keller looked genuinely surprised, his composure cracking for a moment. "How did you know that? It's not in my service record, not in anything the Americans would have captured. Your tactical approach, it's pedagogical. You don't just command soldiers, you teach them principles. Your defensive network wasn't just strong, it was educational. You were showing your men how to think about terrain, about concealment, about coordination. Only a teacher approaches command that way, builds systems that develop understanding rather than just demanding obedience. A slight smile crossed Keller's weathered face, and for a moment he looked like the schoolteacher he had once been. "You're observant about more than just military positions?" "Yes, I taught mathematics and literature for 12 years before the war. I loved it. I was good at it. This," he gestured around them at the military context, "this is not what I wanted from life. But here we are, two educated men trying to kill each other across a frozen valley." "Here we are," Ashworth agreed quietly. What followed was a conversation that Hayes later described as the strangest interaction he had witnessed in 4 years of war. Two soldiers from opposite sides of a conflict speaking different native languages but communicating in English about universal questions, discussing not tactics but the nature of warfare itself, the moral weight of violence, the psychological cost of survival. "You studied psychology before the war?" "Yes," Keller asked. "And literature?" "Psychology and literature at the University of Massachusetts. My father teaches classical studies at Amherst College. He believes war is barbaric, that nothing good comes from violence, that educated men should reject military service entirely, that we should solve conflicts through reason and discourse." "And now, after 3 days lying among corpses after killing 68 men, do you still believe war isn't barbaric?" Ashworth was quiet for a long time. The medical tent was silent except for the hiss of the kerosene heater and distant sounds of military activity outside. Finally he spoke, choosing words carefully. "I believe war is barbaric, and that some wars are necessary. Those aren't contradictory statements, though my father couldn't understand that. The necessity doesn't make it noble. It just makes it necessary. The barbarism doesn't disappear because the cause is just. Both truths coexist." "An honest answer," Keller said approvingly. "Most soldiers I've met either pretend warfare is glorious, wrap it in patriotic rhetoric and heroic narratives, or pretend they had no choice in their actions, claim they were just following orders. You admit you chose this, and you acknowledge the cost. That's rare. That's wisdom." "You said 68 men," Ashworth said quietly, his voice dropping. "I counted 68 shots over 3 days. I don't actually know how many I killed versus wounded. Does the distinction matter morally, philosophically? Perhaps. Practically everyone you shot was removed from the battlefield permanently or temporarily. The tactical effect is the same. But I think you're asking a different question. You're asking if it matters to your soul, if the distinction affects your moral culpability." "Yes." Keller leaned forward, his expression serious and compassionate, speaking now not as enemy officer, but as older man to younger man. "I remember faces too. Through binoculars at 300 meters you can see enough to recognize humanity. One man, I watched you shoot, I think he was Sergeant Hoffman, was laughing at something just before you fired. Probably at a joke, a memory, something human. Another was reading a letter, probably from his wife or mother, touching that connection to home. You saw that too, didn't you? You saw them as people, not just targets." Ashworth nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "Does it haunt you yet?" "Not yet. Right now I'm still in the war. I can compartmentalize, keep it separate, focus on the mission and tactical necessities. But when I go home, when there's no mission anymore, when it's just me and the memories and the faces, I can still see through my scope." Ashworth trailed off. Keller's voice became gentle, almost fatherly. "May I offer you advice from one soldier to another, from someone who's already lived through what you're about to experience? When you go home, when the haunting begins, and it will begin, the faces will visit you in dreams. Remember this. We were soldiers doing soldiers' work. You didn't kill those 68 men because you enjoyed it or because you're evil. You killed them because it was your assigned task in a war you didn't start. The guilt you'll feel is appropriate. It means you remained human through something designed to strip away humanity. But don't let it consume you. They were soldiers too. They understood the contract. What contract? We all signed it when we put on uniforms. We agreed to risk death in service of causes larger than ourselves. Your men, my men, you, me. Everyone who dies in uniform knew the possibility, accepted it implicitly when they took the oath. That doesn't make their deaths meaningless, but it does mean they died within rules we all accepted. You didn't murder them, you fought them. There's a moral difference. This conversation between a 22-year-old American private and a 38-year-old German captain was later described by Hayes as the moment he understood that Ashworth wasn't just an exceptional soldier, but someone wrestling with questions that most soldiers avoided entirely. Questions about moral responsibility, about the nature of justified violence, about how to remain human in circumstances designed to dehumanize. December 28, 1944.
Divisional Headquarters rear area. Thomas Ashworth stood at attention while a colonel pinned the silver star to his uniform. His hands were still bandaged. He stood with visible difficulty, his frostbite-damaged feet barely supporting his weight.
The citation was read aloud to assembled officers and enlisted men. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against the enemy. Private First Class. Thomas Ashworth demonstrated extraordinary courage and tactical innovation during operations in the Hurtgen Forest, December 18th through 22nd, 1944. Through extreme physical hardship and at great personal risk, Private Ashworth identified enemy positions that enabled successful American advances with minimal friendly casualties. His actions resulted in confirmed elimination of 68 enemy personnel and provided intelligence critical to divisional operations. His devotion to duty and exceptional performance reflect great credit upon himself and the United States Army. Hayes whispered to him after the ceremony, after the photographs, after the handshakes from officers who would never understand what the medal represented. They had to tone down the actual story significantly.
If they'd written what you really did, how you did it, the specific methods and the cost, no one would believe it. They'd think we were making up propaganda, creating a superhero narrative for morale purposes. Ashworth's reply was characteristically modest. Good. I don't want people to believe it. I just want it to be over. But it wasn't over.
Word of Ashworth's tactics reached higher headquarters. By January 1945, intelligence officers were studying his operations, recognizing that he had pioneered something fundamentally new in infantry reconnaissance and psychological warfare, something that transcended individual heroism and pointed toward new methodologies. Colonel James Hartwell, divisional intelligence officer, wrote in his formal analysis that would later inform Army doctrine, Private Ashworth's operations represent a fundamental innovation in infantry reconnaissance and psychological warfare.
His recognition that human observers categorize static elements as background information suggests new approaches to camouflage that exploit cognitive biases rather than simply matching visual appearance to environment. More significantly, his demonstration that psychological pressure can degrade enemy performance more effectively than physical destruction challenges conventional assumptions about force employment and the relationship between casualties and combat effectiveness. Recommend further study and potential integration of these principles into advanced training doctrine for Special Operations Forces. By February 1945, Ashworth's techniques were being taught at sniper schools. By 1946, they were incorporated into Army field manuals. By 1950, Special Operations doctrine explicitly referenced Ashworth protocols for long-duration reconnaissance in hostile territory. His methods would influence military operations for generations. But the man himself remained quietly modest about his accomplishments, deflecting credit when asked, insisting he had simply applied common sense to problems others had overthought, that he'd merely used his education in ways the university never intended. Thomas Ashworth returned to regular scout sniper duties in January 1945, but his reputation preceded him like a shadow. German soldiers in sectors where he operated became reluctant to expose themselves, fearing Der Geist, the ghost, the nickname they had given him after learning about his valley operations. His presence had psychological weight even when he wasn't employing his signature technique. He accumulated 34 additional confirmed casualties over 4 months, bringing his total to 102, making him one of the highest-scoring American snipers in the European theater. But he never again attempted the extreme long-duration static position operations that had made him famous. As he told Hayes when asked why he didn't repeat the technique, "That method only works once per sector. After the enemy knows to look for it, the advantage disappears, and you're just lying exposed in freezing temperatures for no tactical gain. War is about adaptation. The side that adapts faster wins. I adapted once, created something new. Now it's someone else's turn to innovate, to find the next unexpected approach. That's how warfare evolves." On April 29, 1945, 3 weeks before German surrender, Ashworth was wounded by artillery fire near Salzburg, Austria. Shrapnel wounds to his left leg and left arm, neither life-threatening, but sufficient for medical evacuation. He spent Victory in Europe Day in a hospital in England reading Hemingway and avoiding conversations with other patients about his service, about what he'd done, about how many men he'd killed. September 1945. Thomas Ashworth returned to Amherst, Massachusetts with a Silver Star. A Purple Heart permanent damage to 3 fingers of his left hand from frostbite and nightmares he refused to discuss with anyone. His father met him at the train station. Their first conversation in 3 years was brief and profound. "You were right," Harold said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I was wrong. War isn't just barbarism. I apologize for not understanding that sooner, for not supporting your decision, for letting you leave without my blessing." Thomas looked at his father with something between affection and sadness. "You were also right.
War is barbarism. We were both correct. That's the part I didn't understand when I enlisted when we argued in your study. We were arguing about the same truth from different angles, both seeing part of the elephant.
They drove home in silence, not hostile silence, but the silence of two people who had reached understanding beyond words, who had finally found common ground in the recognition that truth is often paradoxical, that seemingly contradictory statements can both be valid. Ashworth completed his PhD in psychology at Yale University between 1946 and 1950, focusing on perception, attention, and cognitive bias. His dissertation, Visual Processing Under Stress: How Trained Observers Develop Systematic Blind Spots, never explicitly mentioned his wartime experiences, but colleagues who read his research recognized clear connections between his theoretical framework and practical application, saw the shadow of war in every carefully constructed experiment. One professor told him during his dissertation defense, "Thomas, your understanding of how people see and fail to see things right in front of them is unprecedented in the literature." Where did you develop these insights? What was your fieldwork methodology? Very intensive fieldwork, Ashworth replied carefully, in conditions that weren't repeatable and shouldn't be repeated, with a sample size that would never pass ethical review. He taught psychology at Wesleyan University for 37 years, from 1950 to 1987. He was known as demanding but fair, someone who pushed students to question their assumptions about perception and cognition, who insisted that seeing was about thinking as much as sensing, that observation was an active process of interpretation rather than passive reception of data. He rarely spoke about his military service except in the most general terms. When students occasionally recognized his name from military history texts and asked about the Hurtgen Forest, he would typically redirect the conversation away from war and toward universal principles. That was a long time ago. A different person, a different war. What's relevant for you isn't what happened then. It's understanding how human perception works now in your own lives, so you can see clearly and act wisely regardless of circumstances. But a few students, usually veterans themselves or children of veterans, would recognize something in Ashworth's teaching style. The way he discussed psychological stress with the authority of experience. The way he explained how the human mind creates categories and filters information with specific, vivid examples. The way he taught that seeing isn't just about eyes, but about what the brain chooses to acknowledge, decides to process, bothers to investigate. One student, a veteran taking psychology courses on the GI Bill, stayed after class one day in 1972. "Professor Ashworth, I know who you are, what you did in the war. My father was at Hurtgen, served in 2nd Infantry Division. He told me about Der Geist, the ghost sniper, who changed how we think about reconnaissance and psychological operations, who revolutionized special operations doctrine." Ashworth was quiet for a long moment, staring out the classroom window at students crossing the quad. "What did he tell you exactly? That you were the most dangerous soldier he'd ever heard of? Not because you killed the most men, but because you understood something the rest of us didn't. That the greatest weapon isn't technology or firepower or superior numbers. It's understanding what the enemy expects and operating outside those expectations. He said you proved that one person who thinks differently can change the outcome of battles." Ashworth smiled slightly the first time the student had seen any warmth in his usually reserved expression. "Your father was a perceptive man. Tell him if he's still alive, tell him I hope he found peace after the war. Hope the memories don't weigh too heavily." "Did you find peace?" Long silence. The classroom empty except for the two of them. Winter light fading through tall windows, shadows lengthening across worn desks where generations of students had wrestled with the mysteries of human consciousness. "I found accommodation with what I did. I found understanding of why it was necessary, found ways to use what I learned for teaching, rather than destroying found meaning in helping others see more clearly. That's not quite peace, but it's enough. It has to be enough. We make what peace we can with our choices." December 18th, 1984. 40th anniversary of his first mission. Thomas Ashworth, now 62 years old, received a letter from Germany. Return address, Dresden. He opened it with trembling hands, his frostbite-damaged fingers making the task difficult, joints that never quite recovered their full flexibility. The letter was from Ernst Keller, now 78 years old, retired, living quietly in the city where he had once taught mathematics and literature to children who would later fight in a war that destroyed much of Europe. Keller's letter contained a revelation that would transform Ashworth's understanding of everything that had happened 4 decades earlier. During a veterans' reunion, Keller had learned that a former soldier named Schmidt had been part of the patrol that passed within meters of Ashworth's position on the night of December 18, 1944.
Schmidt had told Keller something he had never reported during the war, had kept secret for 40 years out of shame or fear or complicated conscience. He had seen Ashworth. He had examined the cluster of bodies with his flashlight and had seen eyes move just slightly but enough to notice. He had seen humanity where there should have been only death. When Keller asked why Schmidt hadn't reported this or investigated further, why he hadn't used the probe to verify his suspicions, his answer had been profound and unexpected. Because I knew if someone had the courage to lie there for hours in that cold, perfectly still waiting for us to make mistakes, that person deserved to survive. I had killed enough men by that point in the war. I didn't need to kill that one. Let him be someone else's enemy. Schmidt had deserted 2 weeks later, spending the remainder of the war hiding in a farmhouse basement, had never told his story because he feared being accused of aiding the enemy or failing in his duty of betraying the comrades who died while he chose mercy. Keller's letter concluded, "I share this with you because I think you should know. Your invisibility wasn't perfect. You were seen. But the man who saw you chose to let you remain invisible, chose humanity over duty." Perhaps that's the real lesson of war. Not just how we destroy each other with increasing efficiency, but the moments when we choose not to, when we remember that the enemy is human too. Ashworth read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking worse each time. Then he sat at his desk and composed a response that took him 2 hours to write, revising and reconsidering every sentence, trying to find words adequate to 40 years of misunderstanding. He wrote about gratitude, about understanding, about the recognition that his survival had depended not just on his cleverness and discipline, not just on psychological insight and physical endurance, but on another man's mercy, on a moment of humanity that transcended duty and training and the brutal logic of warfare. He wrote, "Your letter gives me something I didn't have before. Not just gratitude for survival, I already felt fortunate to live when so many died, but gratitude for the reminder that even in the worst circumstances, individual humans can choose mercy over violence, humanity over duty. Please convey my profound thanks to Lieutenant Schmidt if he's still alive. Tell him his decision not to kill me led to 40 years of teaching 3 children who never knew hunger or war and 7 grandchildren who exist because he chose compassion over compliance. Tell him that's a legacy worth having, that his moment of mercy created more life than his years of war destroyed." December 1987. Professor Ashworth gave his final lecture at Wesleyan University before retirement. The lecture hall was packed, standing room only students and colleagues who wanted to hear his last professional words. The topic, what we see when we look, the psychology of attention and expectation. 90 minutes of carefully constructed argument about how human perception works, supported by decades of research and insight earned through experience most of his students would never imagine. He discussed experiments and case studies, visual illusions and cognitive biases, the architecture of attention, and the limitations of consciousness. In the final 5 minutes, he deviated from his prepared notes, speaking from somewhere deeper than academic knowledge. "I've spent my career teaching you that vision isn't about light hitting your retina. It's about your brain deciding what matters, choosing what to process, determining what deserves conscious attention. You see what you expect to see. You ignore what you've been trained to ignore." This principle applies to everything. It applies to how soldiers watch battlefields. It applies to how you'll watch your lives unfold. Most of what happens around you, most of what's truly important, will be invisible because your mind has categorized it as background information, as processed data that requires no further consideration. A student raised her hand. "Professor Ashworth, is there a personal story behind this? It feels like you're speaking from experience beyond academic research, like there's something specific you're trying to tell us." He smiled, a complex expression, mixing warmth and sadness and hard-earned wisdom. "Once, a very long time ago, I learned that being invisible doesn't mean you're hidden. It means you're positioned where others have learned not to look. And I learned that someone can always choose to look, can always decide to see what training tells them to ignore. When they do, your life depends on what they decide to do with what they see. That's true in war. That's true in peace. That's true in everything that matters." The room was silent. "So my final advice to you is this. Look at the background. Pay attention to what you've been trained to ignore. The most important things in life are often the ones we've learned to dismiss as irrelevant. The person you walk past every day without seeing, the opportunity disguised as an obstacle, the truth hiding in plain sight because it conflicts with your expectations. Learn to see clearly. That's the only skill that truly matters." Thomas Ashworth died January 15, 1994, age 71, from complications of pneumonia. His funeral was attended by more than 300 people. Former students who remembered specific lectures, colleagues who had watched him build a remarkable career, family members who knew only fragments of his story,
and a surprising number of elderly veterans who had traveled from across the country to pay respects to a man most of them had never met, but whose techniques had influenced their training and perhaps saved their lives in jungles, deserts, mountains across subsequent decades of conflict. At the service, his daughter Sarah read from a journal entry he had written decades earlier, found among his papers after his death, carefully preserved in a folder marked "For After." People ask if I'm proud of what I did in the war. The honest answer is complicated. I'm proud that I used my mind effectively under extreme circumstances, that I proved intellect could compete with firepower. I'm proud that my actions saved American lives, gave soldiers a chance to go home who might otherwise have died.
but I'm not proud that I killed 102 men who were in most cases just following orders from their own commanders, trying to survive like everyone else, wanting to go home to their own families. Necessary doesn't mean proud. Justified doesn't mean celebrated. What I hope people understand is that warfare tests everything about you. Your courage, your intelligence, your endurance, and most importantly, your humanity. The real victory isn't surviving the test. It's remaining recognizably human on the other side of it, retaining the capacity for mercy and doubt and moral complexity. I think I managed that. Mostly. The valley in the Hurtgen forest where Thomas Ashworth spent 3 days in December 1944 is now peaceful woodland. Hiking trails wind through terrain that once ran with blood. Historical markers describe the broader campaign without mentioning individual actions that occurred there, without naming the scholar who became a ghost.
But for military professionals who study the evolution of infantry tactics, that small patch of ground represents a significant moment in the history of warfare. A demonstration that even in industrialized, mechanized modern combat, individual genius properly applied could still shape the outcome of battles. A reminder that the greatest innovations often come not from technology, but from understanding human psychology and having the courage to operate outside conventional expectations. Thomas Ashworth's legacy lives not in monuments or medals, but in the doctrine taught to special operations forces worldwide, in the principles of psychological warfare that evolved from his insights, and in the lives of soldiers who survived, because someone once proved that seeing clearly matters more than shooting accurately, that understanding the enemy's mind is more valuable than destroying the enemy's body. He remains even in death what he was in life. A scholar who understood that the greatest weapon is knowledge, a soldier who proved that courage and intelligence combined can achieve what firepower alone cannot. A teacher who spent his life helping others see more clearly through the fog of their own expectations and assumptions. A ghost who became visible only after he chose to step into the light, and who taught us all that being seen isn't a